Good evening and welcome to the sixth in our anniversary series of lectures. I'm Wally Fletcher and I'm the chair of the board of our Philadelphia School of Psychoanalysis. Our school and our clinic, the consultations at our school and our clinic, the consultation center, we are celebrating 50 years of providing modern psychoanalytic training and community mental health services to students, clinicians, and clients of a wide diversity and need. Our series is entitled Modern Psychoanalysis, Adaptations and Advances, to emphasize our commitment to the ongoing evolution and advancement of psychoanalysis as a profession and as a provider of therapies of depth, insight, relationship, and inclusion for people of all sorts and conditions. This evening, it is our great pleasure to welcome licensed clinical social worker and psychoanalyst Chanda Griffin to present to us on the topic of race and ethnicity within the transference and countertransference matrix, locating racial trauma and dissociation in the treatment dyad. Efforts to promote inclusion, anti-racism, cultural competency, and cultural humility have been a focus of attention in the helping professions for some time. Unfortunately, there has been too little focus on the depth dimensions of unconscious bias and racial trauma that create powerful resistances to the personal and social change we say we want. This is an area in which psychoanalysis can and has contributed a great deal, but not nearly enough. Even psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic institutes have a racial unconscious. This is evidenced by the proportionally smaller numbers of racial ethnic minorities that enter our profession or seek psychoanalytic treatment. Fortunately, Chanda Griffin is one of the increasing number of groundbreaking psychoanalysts determined to make a difference in this regard. Chanda Griffin earned her master's in social work at New York University. She is presently a teaching, training, and supervising analyst at the Manhattan Institute for Psychoanalysis and co-chair of the Committee on Race and Ethnicity at the Manhattan Institute. Additionally, she is a faculty member of the National Institute for Psychotherapies, the Institute for Contemporary Psychoanalysis, and an adjunct professor at the Silberman Graduate School of Social Work at Hunter College. Chanda is also a member of Black Psychoanalysts Speak, an organization, the mission of which is to enable the voices and ideas of Black psychoanalysts to be heard in psychoanalysis and in the wider world, and to draw our attention within psychoanalysis and its related clinical and scholarly fields to the concerns of Black people. Chanda is in private practice in New York City, and we're eager to engage with what she has to share with us this evening. So thanks for being with us, Chanda, and welcome. It's all yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Wally, for that beautiful introduction. And thank you, PSP, for inviting me for your 50th anniversary series. Here's the 50 more. So I'm going to read my presentation, and I am inviting you to sit with the material. I'll repeat myself, to sit with the material once I complete it, and listen and stay attuned to your bodies throughout the presentation. What does it mean to claim the slave? Is it a pilgrimage to Ghana, the door to no return, to find lost mothers, fathers, children? What does it mean to claim the slave? Is it to cross the Atlantic by boat, watch the waves in the wake? What does it mean to claim the slave? Is it to visit the plantation, walk the cotton fields of the South, the sugarcane fields of the Caribbean? What does it mean to claim the slave? Is it to eat cornbread and collards, coconut milk and callaloo? What does it mean to claim the slave? Is it night terrors, body tremors, touching the ghosts of night? What does it mean to claim the slave? Is it the tears, hollowed stomach, body ache of despair? What does it mean to claim the slave? Is it knowing but not, searching for meaning forever lost? In preparing for this presentation, I read Saidiya Hartman's Lose Your Mother, an autobiographical and historical narrative of her pilgrimage to Ghana to claim the slave. I found myself repeating that question to myself in a spoken word cadence, and the question and answers becoming more painful with more feeling as I went along. The question eludes me, but I know it matters. I have not been to Ghana, nor scoured the historical texts of slave narratives. I've yet to visit Mississippi, my mother's home, where she picked cotton, fished, played in the trees, and stole her neighbor's watermelon. I've yet to visit the grocery store where my grandfather signed his name with an X. And when asked why not, I would say, too many ghosts. So why now am I asking, what does it mean to claim the slave? Why does it matter to me or to this presentation on racial transference and countertransference? For a few years now, I've presented and or provided many courses on racial transference and countertransference, emphasizing the interconnection of the intrapsychic and interpersonal within the larger socio-political context of race and racism. The discussions have included how transference dynamics in the consulting room include internalized representations, that these internalizations are not culturally neutral, but organizing principles in relation to whiteness and power that become the stuff of enactments. As an interpersonal analyst and working in the here and now, the focus has largely been to address what is happening in the room between my patient and I, with attunement to language, lacuna, gaps in narrative and memory, and my countertransference reactions. However, in the storm of a global pandemic and racial unrest, along with heightened vulnerability, I've witnessed in my patients and myself trauma-based phenomena as it relates to race and dissociated self-states, affective and somatic reactions that are difficult to make meaning out of, except within the historical context of slavery. So in other words, it has not been enough for me to know the racial self-other internalizations, ego defenses of idealization or devaluation, and power differentials without integrating the legacy of slavery. Slavery, the national stain and shame that this country would have us forget or remember as an event in time, was not just an event, it was a relationship. As Gump writes, a relation of domination, constituted by the objectification of the African as subhuman, superhuman, inhuman, by virtue of the blackness of their skin. And in this relational process, obliterating any subjectivity, obliterating the self-experience, relegating the African to the social location of non-status and non-being. It is this historical and inherited non-status, non-being, and the unthinkable and the unknowable violence against Black bodies that is the afterlife of slavery, the traumata transmitted over generations through the body. My query is, how has this historical trauma impacted the Black psyche and Black subjectivity? And more specifically, what has been dissociated? What is the unthinkable, unknowable, unspeakable, dreaded, not me, that must be disavowed? Through a case vignette, my aim is to give an experience near description where the afterlife of slavery, its trauma and dissociation are embedded, embodied, and enacted within the treatment. I will follow with how I've used this experience to guide my work in treatment with BIPOC patients and Black patients across the diaspora. Approximately 2 weeks after the repeated televised death of George Floyd, I began to note the changes and reactions for both me and many of my BIPOC patients. 3 months into a global pandemic and social isolation, I've watched the news daily. There continues to be several hundred people dying a day, and Governor Cuomo has reported that the populations most impacted and specifically dying are Black and Brown people as a result of health disparities and or not having the privilege of isolating due to employment or living circumstances. In the midst of this are a growing number of BLM protests, some of which have escalated to police violence and riots. I'm aware of my efforts to regulate my affective and bodily states and how I'm experiencing a certain level of detachment. I reasoned that I must stay grounded, curious, and open to make space for varying thoughts, feelings, and reactions of my patients. I remember their initial reactions to the pandemic and the televised death of Floyd, and considered that there may be similar reactions and or escalating symptoms to the escalating violence and an uncertainty that we were now living in. The sessions are similar, with expressions of anger, sadness, hopelessness, and despair. While I was thinking more than feeling, I respond robotically. It is sad, it is angry, it is enraging. The sessions with patients who demonstrated an equal amount of isolation of affect were easier, and we often just changed the subject. I began my session with Nate, a 56-year-old cisgendered hetero African-American male who has been in psychoanalytic psychotherapy for 3 years now at 2 times a week. Nate originally presented with symptoms of depression, hopelessness, fatigue, and a decreased interest in activities he otherwise enjoyed, such as martial arts, bike riding, and gardening. Over the course of treatment, Nate and I have discovered that he fluctuates from feeling either very anxious, agitated, and angry, or hopeless, detached, and numb. When anxious and angry, he is often critical of his wife and children for not valuing or respecting him, and critical of me for not, quote, giving him insight, unquote. When he is presenting as more depressed and detached, his hopelessness is expressed by resolving that his needs will not be met by anyone. He feels alone and muses about what he is going to do to take care of himself. There are times when Nate presents as freer to engage, curious and willing to expose more of himself, what he knows, what he desires, and what he hopes for in the future. We have had many a discussion of his wealth of knowledge of Black history, existentialism, and gardening. But within this context of chaos and uncertainty, along with my in and out detachment, I'm not sure what I'm going to get today or what I'm going to give. So I feel a sense of dread and I ask, how am I going to fail him today? How am I not going to be enough? Nate starts the session discussing how this world, more specifically, this country, is out of control. Nate spoke to the uncertainty of everything, with the current escalating violence and riots, visuals of the streets burning. He says, there's no protection for Black people in this country. I'm going to the shooting range this week. I just feel, I don't know what is going on. I don't know what's going to happen, but I want to be prepared to protect myself and my family. As he continues to talk, I feel my anxiety, feel, and anger increase, and my imagination running amok. I see my patient in front of his lovely home, a mob, police, missiles, all sorts of things. And all I hear is shooting ranges, guns, protection, violence, dead bodies, more guns. My questions and comments become increasingly more pointed and, dare I say, hostile. Exactly who are you protecting yourself from, Nate? He says, I don't know, but things are crazy out there. I say, do you think there's going to be a revolution or a civil war? Are your guns going to help you protect you against the US military? I know that also in my hurt and anger, I want to ask, why are you telling me this when you know I hate guns? Are you trying to scare me? It's my inside voice. Nate hears my disapproval. He is measured, resolute, and expresses his need to prepare himself to protect himself and his family. He defensively presents as if he is unfazed by my reactions, and I think I hear relief and a smile in his voice as he says, I know you don't like guns, And I just respond, no, I don't. And we continue the session discussing other matters. He had moved on, but I was shaken out of my cozy, grounded state, an illusion of safety and invulnerability. These affective and visceral states would continue to reverberate long after the session, all organized around his guns and potential violence. Filled with fear, terror, and impotent rage, I felt powerless. I felt out of control. I questioned if my patient was out of control. And with the city burning around me, and the question of whether or not there was going to be a revolution, that the world was out of control. I remember what I knew about Nate, the cyclist, the yogi, and the keto expert, the avid reader, gardener, husband, father, bread maker. He bought a bread maker like lots of people did as soon as the pause started or social isolation. Those firearms, all of which were in safety boxes and shelved, had been collecting dust for years. And having not gone to the shooting range for years, I guess he needed to practice. There was nothing in Nate's mental health history indicative of someone who was in imminent danger to himself or others. So how did my inquiry and subsequent interaction become so focused on the firearms? Why was I so afraid, terrified, enraged, and feeling helpless? Was this projective identification? Was Nate giving me his experience? Was I to feel his fear and helplessness and or his rage? Or was this my fear, terror, and rage, concordant internalized objects that have found their mates? Were Nate and I in what Davies describes as an introjective, projective hot potato toss of I'm bad, no, you're bad? Was I the good analyst, disavowing my terror and rage while locating it in him and in my clinical risk assessment, questioning if he was homicidal? Did I need to control Nate? I considered the possible familial transferences. Nate's present but emotionally absent mother and authoritative punitive father, both of whom he experiences burdened by his presence. Their attention only peaked when he was bad, misbehaving, and in need of discipline. I wondered if Nate, in his fear of his own rage and aggression, was hoping for me to rein him in. Or was that my wish? Maybe he just wanted to wake me up. While I was unearthing various intrapsychic origins and early childhood relational dynamics to understand the recent interaction between us, I considered again the current context. We had both witnessed another murder of a Black man. And now there were more reports of victims to mourn. Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor. My media feeds were flooded with stories and videos of murders past. Michael Brown, Trayvon Martin, Eric Gardner, Sandra Bland, Philando Castillo, videos of stop and frisk, stop and ID, and increased focus or comparison of historical trauma that included postcards with lynchings as art and photos of actual lynchings. I had never seen postcards of lynchings at that point. Is this where the legacy of slavery and the present precarious conditions of the Black person's freedom verge? How does slavery, or the vestiges of slavery, feel so proximate to the current racial climate? Hartman states, if slavery persists as an issue in the political life of Black America, it is not because of an antiquarian obsession with the bygone days or the burden of a too long memory, but because Black lives are still imperiled and devalued by a racial calculus and a political arithmetic that were entrenched centuries ago. This is the afterlife of slavery: skewed life chances, limited access to health and education, premature death, incarceration, and impoverishment. She then says, I too, I am the afterlife of slavery. The enactment between Nate and I was shaped by our transferences as well as racial trauma or race-based stress that was activated by current events. However, this trauma is the convergence of both past and present traumata. Vaughn's writes, the contemporary experiences constitute an unconscious agitation or reawakening of unmetabolized earlier trauma, generating a sense of disease and a breeding ground for a number of dissociated responses to ward off an impending sense of doom, loss, humiliation, failure, and a disconnect from society. And to add, the definition of racial trauma captures what I am describing to some degree. Racial trauma or race-based stress refers to the events of danger related to real and perceived experiences of racial discrimination. These include threats and injury, humiliating and shaming events, as well as witnessing harm to other people of color due to racism. Many of the symptoms of race-based trauma are similar to PTSD. However, because racial trauma involves ongoing injuries to exposure, ongoing injuries, both direct and vicarious, it differs in its pervasiveness and its intergenerational impact on families of color. In this case, the repeated televised murder of George Floyd, as well as racial unrest throughout the country, was the real event. The perceived experience of danger would be Nate's expressed anxiety and concern, and his need to protect himself. And for me, my need to protect myself by detaching or locating the danger in my patient. Research findings for racial trauma suggest that it is the perception of danger that has the most deleterious impact on the Black psyche, particularly if the person has a more passive position, feels hopeless, helpless, and unable to control what is happening. As I learned more about racial and transgenerational trauma, I made more contact with my experiences and perceptions of both impending doom and annihilatory anxiety in adulthood, and connected more with the memories of my earlier years. I remember at the age of 8, sitting on the steps in front of our apartment, looking into the sky that seemed so blue and vast. It was a beautiful, ominous day. When I go back to that image of myself as a small child and feeling small and alone, I know that I embodied a young girl in despair, hopeless, afraid of what was to come next. It wasn't an acute anxiety, it was more of a hopeless dread. My mother and father expressed their own burdened existence. I, along with my siblings, were cared for and received our basic needs, food, clothing, and shelter, and the occasional kiss at night before bed. But there were no hugs, no I love yous, no loving gazes. My mother's emotional responses were either anger with the subsequent corporal punishment, contempt if I expressed neediness, which she called whining, or nothing. She'd be infuriated with me if I hurt myself playing or if I was too loud and rambunctious. And sometimes it seemed that my very life force would be the death of her. I felt like I lost my mother. I don't know at what age, but I continued to try to find her love. And as I grew older, I began asking her about her childhood, and her lived pain was worse than mine. As sharecroppers, she witnessed her illiterate father's subjugation to a landowner they picked cotton for. And I should note that she didn't tell me many of these stories until I was much older, really in her final years of life. She witnessed her mother as a victim of partner abuse, and she suffered her mother's hatred and contempt for her. The narrative she relayed to me for most of her life did not include too many stories of racism, even though she grew up in the deep South. And even if they did, she was always the superior one with the feisty retort. In retrospect, I do not think she wanted to know how the legacy of slavery was embedded in her daily life as a sharecropper's daughter, much like many African Americans shamed by this history and prefer to be future focused and not wanting to know. not wanting to know a relation of domination, terror, sadness, and despair. I would inherit that from her. As I introspected more about the racial enactment between Nate and I, more of my memories of childhood would emerge, along with more affective and somatic responses. And I began to read more about transgenerational trauma and its location in the body. In my grandmother's hand, Menachem discusses how trauma is passed down from generation to generation, body to body, genetically, and described this as trauma retentions. And there's some significant scientific research on epigenetics, the study of change in gene expression. If you get his book, he references two studies. One of them is interesting. I'll just share really quickly about, it's called Parental Olfactory Experience Influences Behavior and Neural Structure in Subsequent Generations, where mice were sprayed with a scent that smelled like cherries and also shocked. And their progeny, the children after, the little mice after, had the same reaction to the cherry spray, an adverse reaction. And the other study is called Holocaust Exposure Induced Intergenerational Effects. So check them out. He added that memories are also passed down and held in the body, not only the brain, whereby the person experiences a persistent sense of imminent doom, or in his description, trauma ghostings. You read the stuff, there's a lot of ghosting going on. Vons writes that it is through the internalization of cultural introjects African Americans carry the historical trauma of slavery and a heightened sense of unknown fears that contribute to psychological, biological, and behavioral symptomatology. I am positing that this is the dissociated experience of the slave, the unknowable and unthinkable violence to the body, lost mothers, fathers, and children, complete erasure of subjectivity, erasure, obliteration of the self, that is the dreaded not me, that is inherited and embodied by descendants of slaves. This is a protective dissociation as to maintain an inner core sense of self, as the unthinkable and unspeakable cannot be symbolized or affectively regulated. It comes with a cost. As Bromberg states, dissociation corrupts desire, creates an attenuated desire, a constricted desire to be recognized in one's full subjectivity, and that becomes infused with shame and humiliation. I have witnessed this constricted desire in many of my patients, many of them not feeling the freedom to be themselves and to fully embody their desire. Physical constriction. An example, a Black male patient described how he is very aware of his body in the presence of police officers. His hands are always in the open. And he added that he must always look ahead when walking up the street with a smile, lest he disarm a white woman or be bumped into on the street, because he says, they don't see me. And he's 6'4". There's affective and cognitive constrictions. A Black female patient who described how she chooses her words carefully, or code switches, as to not to present as unintelligent or the angry Black woman. She has an Ivy League education. And I don't give examples, but the constriction, the constricted desires for love and to be loved out of fear of loss are pervasive. I guess one that I'll just say one certainly is with children. These examples don't fully cover the physical and psychic energy used to offset the shame infused experience of living while Black. But you see it in Black children. And I believe it's one of the reasons that, for the most part, within the white gaze, Black children are perceived as older than they are. It reminds me of I was looking at Nas's album cover, Illmatic, and it's a photo of him at 8 or 9 years of age. And he just looks like he has the weight of the world on his face. If you see that album, it's top 5. He's top 5 greatest hip hop artists. No one can disagree with that. So I digress. What was my innate attenuated desire or shame to be warded off in our interaction? I believe the attenuated desire shame we shared as descendants of slaves was wanting to be recognized in our full humanity and subjectivity. But knowing that in our Black skinned bodies, we are a phobogenic object. We evoke fear, hatred, and threat in this world, is what's this about. How does one make meaning out of repeated images of Black bodies subjected to violence, murder, and treated as non-beings? And I say that you don't. So for me and it, protectively, we both dissociated from this historical material reality, deflected our affective responses toward each other to control and have power over something. In this survival mode of fight or flight, there is no space to mourn, to fully feel the sadness and despair, which I believe is underneath or disavowed. You know, when I reflect on this enactment, I imagine the relational dynamics of slaves as witnesses to violence and those who resisted such violence. And I wonder, was I desiring to protect Nate, as slave mothers protected their sons? And or was it about protecting myself in relationship to my whiteness by way of analytic authority? And like I said, when in survival mode, there is no room to mourn. Listening for the phantom voices of our ancestors. Abraham and Turek speak to how psychoanalytic inquiry must extend beyond the familial, and I will add the interpersonal in the consulting room, as patients and analysts inherit secret psychic substance of our ancestors. And for this, we must listen for the phantom voices of different generations and patients under treatment. Grant states, the grand forgetting is the first condition of the devil's dissociative contagion. These voices, however, don't speak in words, the unspeakable, and our ears do not hear the unknowable. The dissociated not me traumata are experienced within the affective and somatic registers of our body. My affective and somatic countertransference, fear, terror, rage, dread, helplessness, and powerlessness, were useful indicators of both my and Nate's dissociated self-states that resulted in an enactment. Rappaport discusses how somatic experiencing enables patients to move into warded off self-states that initially disappeared the body, separated the psyche from the soma. Working with somatic transference and shifting from the analytic frame of making meaning through language, talking, is a shift that I believe is necessary when working with racial trauma. Knobloch speaks to how many of our psychoanalytic practices, such as laying on the couch or sitting in one position, disappear the body. He emphasizes that when analyzing race in the transference, words often do not capture the painful emotional suffering as a result of racial trauma. This is not to say we do away with meaning making and symbolizing experience through language. It merely means that with racial trauma, just as with other traumas, we stand in the spaces, notice, and give recognition to the patient's experience, often only registered on the somatic level. Once I freed myself up to feel first, question, and create meaning out of my experience, later I could sit with my embodied experience and ask him more about his visceral states surrounding race. Many of our sessions consisted of breathing, locating bodily sensations, and then feelings. I then could hear Nate and the ancestors' voices in the room. Nate shared more of his childhood memories of feeling or being in a perpetual state of anxiety and anticipated disaster. He stated that eventually he began to try to regulate his anxiety and feelings of dread by creating the trouble he expected to be punished for, by throwing rocks at cars, disrupting the class, and fighting with classmates. Although he would later focus his energies on basketball or books, he would continue to feel an impending sense of doom and at other times rage, but always with the desire to quiet those voices and lessen those feelings. Nate and I continue to process how his oscillating between feelings of anxious dread, anger, rage, and or emptiness is related to his past, mostly familial experiences. I've not found a way to integrate the historical legacy of slavery with him as of yet, in a psychoeducational way, if you will. And I think it's because I am still in process myself. I'm still ferreting this out. In the wake of Blackness and being, Christina Sharp beautifully uses the metaphor of the wake, keeping watch over the dead or the tracks left on the water surface by a ship. She describes living in the wake of slavery as living in a form of Black consciousness and discusses the imperative for wake work, imagining new ways to live and rupturing epistemes. I have found wake work useful with other patients, or my form of it within this field, that consists of exploring the impact of traumatic histories, the historical roots that impact their current subjectivity. I worked with the same-sex male queer gay couple, John White Jewish and Kevin Black African American, both male. They entered treatment to address their communication issues like most couples. And one of their presenting problems was surrounding food, or more specifically, to eat or not to eat leftovers. John would express with righteous indignation the importance of conserving food now and how it should not be wasted. And Kevin would express his desire to live in the moment and eat what they wanted for the day. The argument seems simple enough, it's just food, but arguments with couples is never simple. It's never just the food, right? However, it was far more serious for the couple, as John would become very panicked if he noticed that food had been spoiled, and enraged with his partner if Kevin refused to eat leftovers. In exploration, we discovered the cultural significance of both of their experiences. Although John was from a well-to-do family, he was a descendant of Holocaust survivors, whereby he learned to conserve food. However, his degree of panic and anxiety suggested much more of a traumatic reaction. In this case, the legacy or the vestiges of the Holocaust, and so many people, losing body weight, starving. And for Kevin, growing up in poverty, along with his ancestral history of slavery, the deprivation of food or good food held a different cultural significance. As an African American, and with his history or his familial background of growing up in poverty, tomorrow is not promised, so you eat as much as you can when you can. Both partners were more connected with the parts of them connected to their history eventually, and they were able to have more sympathy and compassion for each other. Okay. So in closing, there are a few things to consider. Racial transference and countertransference are an amalgamation of intrapsychic, interpersonal, current, and historical socio-political contexts. And this requires us to be attuned to each of these aspects of treatment. Within the interpersonal dynamic, it's racial trauma and dissociated aspects of the self that are enacted, And these aspects of the self carry voices and experiences from our past that will remain ghosts if we do not listen to them. This is what I believe I mean when I say claiming the slave, reaching for that which is dissociated and making some attempt to recognize my own and my patient's experience, first through the body and then through the understanding of transgenerational trauma, in the hopes of transforming what is dreaded and disavowed into hope and desire, into psychic freedom. What it means for the institution of psychoanalysis, in my opinion, is giving greater scrutiny to our theories in the ways they are limited in their understanding of Black subjectivity, and to be open to other epistemes, such as art, music, Black philosophers, Black writers, Black analysts, with experienced near perspectives on Blackness and being. This is the end of my presentation. And now I'll ask you again to sit with it for a moment, scan your bodies first, and then check in with your feelings and thoughts. And I'd also ask you to try to connect with your historical roots and consider the legacy of any historical trauma in your lineage as well. So since I've more recently been connecting or integrating my assessment of racialized transference and countertransference from a trauma lens, one of the things that I let participants know is that in these spaces, and also with your patients, you feel it first before you think it. And it's usually almost like a shock sometimes. It could be a shock to the body, or you find yourself leaving the room, which is clearly a dissociated experience as well.
Chanda, if you're ready, there is a question that someone posed here.
Yeah.
Lisa is asking if you could speak more about what wake work looks like in the treatment room.
I think, as far as I understand it for myself at this point, because remember, I'm still ferreting it out, is that when my patients are having a physical or an affective reaction, and it could be an event, a national event like a murder, which continues to happen. It could be a situation in the workplace where they don't understand why they've lost the capacity to speak or to think in the face of a macroaggression or some racialized enactment. They are feeling either frozen or very, very enraged, and they can't necessarily fully make meaning out of it. Some of the wake work starts with talking about it's in their DNA, just starting with the body. And then some of it is psychoeducational, where I say, this is the legacy of slavery. You've inherited this part, it's in your body, basically. And we might even talk about not to give a history lesson or anything like that, but even talk about what the slave may have experienced based on what we know, based on narratives. And it's the same for, just as I was giving the example for my couple, this panic reaction that one of the partners was having, it was beyond just like sort of a moral belief about conserving and not wasting food. We did some exploration about talking about the family, and then also, this connection to the Holocaust. And so that's a part of it, connecting it to the history, but finding new ways to live, to me, working in wake work, is just them, one, knowing that this is not all, they're bearing the weight in their body of several generations. And that if they can breathe through that without panicking through it, then they can find another way to respond to it, find a new way of responding to it. That's how I see it.
I guess I could present my own question. When you talked about that experiment where the rats were shocked, how that memory carried over to the next generation through the body, was there? I wonder how many generations does that sort of memory carry on through? Is it diminished? Does it attenuate as the generations progress and you get further and further away from the shock in space and time? Do you know?
I don't know the specificities of that study. I can tell you what I think about it for Black folks, though. This is why it doesn't attenuate, because Black people are constantly given the experience and images that they're still a non-being status in this country. And so you have slavery for over, 200 centuries, basically. I mean, 2 centuries plus. And then you still have the repeated experience of your subjectivity, your humanity being an object, being a site of violence and erasure. So
thank you. A couple of more questions came in. One asks if you could talk a bit more about the intersection between somatic work and psychoanalytic work.
So I trained as an analyst first. I mean, historically, psychoanalysis has always been about trauma. We've gotten away from it, but that's where it started, right? I trained as an analyst first, and what that meant for me was asking questions, listening, sometimes interpreting things, asking the question, how do you feel? But integrating trauma work is not just asking how you feel, it's saying, Where do you feel it in your body? And then sometimes that means that I'm not asking any questions. And as I said with my patient, literally asking where's in the body, sometimes to visualize it, and sometimes just to breathe. Literally, it's just that simple, like to take deep breaths. Because, and it's not, I know that in this presentation, I spoke mostly about a pretty horrific event. You know, my patients experience this shock to the system quite a bit in their worlds, in the working place, you know, going into the grocery store. And so in those moments, this is just what I've witnessed, they're having trouble thinking anything. They're so overstimulated or understimulated because they've dissociated, left their bodies, that it becomes really important in that moment to not ask a whole bunch of questions unless it's connected to the body. And once they're more connected to their body in that way, then we can try to understand it a little bit more. In respect to the transferences that are taking place, they have reactions towards me. So possibly othering them. And that's something that I think we have to take into consideration as analysts, and it being a historically, and still is, white profession, is that there is a perception that their subjective experience in their Black bodies is going to be pathologized in some way. And you see it can happen really quickly. I did it, and I'm Black. So I think we have to take into consideration how, just in the process of trying to make meaning out of something that is not fully symbolizable in the moment. It's just, you know, how do you symbolize the experience of non-beingness, basically? You know, we have to think about how we approach it, and not re-traumatize our patients through our psychoanalytic frame in a lot of ways too. So I hope I was clear. I got lost in my thought, moved away.
There's another question here about that first one was from Nikki Cohen. Thanks, Nikki. And the second one, what helps you connect with and hear the voices of the ghosts of the past?
I think there are a couple of things. It certainly helps to have some, for a lack of a better description, cultural competence around these things, right? It's not everything, but it helps to have some education about colonialism, about, you know, the history of race in this country, the ways even white people, you know, Europeans who immigrated here were blackened. It certainly is helpful to have education around slavery. So that helps me hear the voices, just knowing that existed. But at the risk of sounding repetitive, I feel like the more that I'm attuned to what's happening in my body, and the more that I trust that especially if the patient is, if I experience them as detached, the more that I trust that that is a signal for something beyond perhaps just the two of us in the room, then I can ask more questions about their familial experiences. And then I'm keeping racial and ethnic location in my mind, and I'm connecting it to that as well.
Okay. Another question from Karen. Could you talk about the intersection between social trauma and early childhood neglect that may have other roots?
It may, or that does have other roots. I'm sorry, could you read that again?
Sure. Could you talk about the intersection between social trauma and early childhood neglect that may have other roots?
I'm not sure if I understand the question when you say other roots, like other forms of trauma.
Perhaps Karen Gennaro, if you could speak to that.
Because let me tell you why I'm saying that, Karen, is because all trauma is social in my mind as an interpersonal relational analyst. Now,
what I meant by social trauma, what I meant by social trauma is I was just sort of categorizing, let's say, racial trauma or trauma from the Holocaust or something like that. That's what I meant by putting it in that category of the word social trauma. But I know I've had some patients who've been from families impacted by the Holocaust who, have behaviors that they easily want to attribute to their Holocaust past, when there's so much more. And I was just wondering, if you come across that and how you can kind of negotiate that.
Well, I hope, like, with the time that we have, we can have some conversation, because when you say there's so much more, what do you mean by that?
Let's, a case I'm thinking of when there was, an early maternal death, abusive father, neglectful older sister, and the patient ended up sort of functioning with multiple traumas, not just the fact that she had kind of inherited the trauma from the familial Holocaust issue, but other things that were very significant in her life that she doesn't really seem to want to look at as possibilities for contributing to her character development.
Mm-hmm. Well, the way that I frame it is, even with the familial trauma that you're describing, right? The relational trauma there, I would argue that it is connected to the Holocaust and beyond, and the abject status of Jewish people in this country and beyond this country. You can, and this is what we do. This is, I guess, one of the things that I'm speaking to. You can focus on the familial and keep it there, and for some, that's one way to work, and I think that traditionally psychoanalysis has worked that way. Or you could couch it in a larger context, which I believe plays a part in familial traumatic relationships.
Yeah, I think it's important to keep both of them, and sometimes it's challenging. Sometimes somebody doesn't want to consider, the impact of, let's say, the broader exposure that they may have had. And other people might not want to consider more of the, micro problems, but, it seems like it's all important.
Thank you.
And I'm just concerned about sometimes losing the forest for the trees or vice versa. But thank you.
Okay. There's another question from Betty Ann. And Betty Ann Kaplan, I'm having a little difficulty following this. So if you could help out here too to clarify what your question is. In your own honest appraisal of your countertransference, there seems a split between what we feel in relation to the external and what we dive into in our own personal history when the trauma and ongoing trauma, and then there's a parenthetical statement that says no safety here. How did you negotiate that split? So there's discussion about the split, and I'm just a little confused about the question. Betty Ann, if you could help out, I'd appreciate it.
Thanks. Yeah, Betty Ann. What do you mean by that?
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think as a therapist and analyst, when the external reality, the social reality as we see it in the media, as we experience it, George Floyd, and currently the atrocities that are occurring in the Ukraine, that we as individuals and as therapists who are resonating with historical trauma are torn. I find myself torn in a reaction to what is going on, very real. You said that there's a real difference between historical and intergenerational trauma and trauma that is ongoing. When there is no safety, if you are under attack, you have very little psychological room to reflect. So I find us as therapists in a peculiar position, and particularly as psychoanalytic therapists and analysts, because we are focused on the internal experience. And in the countertransference, there's a similar conundrum in a sense, because as you describe, we are living the trauma as well as experiencing personally and through our patients the historical and internalized trauma. And so I think about what is our position as a therapist and how do we negotiate that? Does that just clarify? I don't know if it does or not.
Well, I'm just agreeing with you. I guess you were speaking to a split, and I wasn't sure what you meant by the split.
I didn't mean a split in the sense of a dissociated, split off. I didn't mean that.
That's what's been really, this is sort of what's prompted my work around trauma, is that, in the past 2 years, I couldn't fully distance myself as an observer of so much in the participation of a shared trauma with so many of my patients of color. And so still as an analyst, yeah, it's just challenging because I'm trying to figure out what's mine, what's theirs, what's both of ours in here. What do we share? What don't we? Which is, and all of those things are in play. It really challenges being in a shared trauma around race and even the pandemic. Really challenges these notions of containment and this idea that as the analyst, I'm going to be able to metabolize the experience in such a way that, I can make meaning out of it for my patient, and it'll be about the patient when I'm in it just like they are. So there isn't I didn't find a lot of separation. Until I did, and it meant that I needed to make more contact with myself around, my reactions, and then bring it back to work with my patient, Nate, so he could speak to his own. So I guess that's what I was hearing from what you're saying, just like, we're not, we don't have this position, and I think particularly around race, we don't have this position in entirety to be observers and of our patient's experience, because we're very much in this matrix with them. We're struggling with trying to make meaning out of our own racialized experience, and we all have the same hegemonic father. So sometimes I visualize it that way, almost like two siblings that grew up in the same household and suffering the same authority in different ways, of course, but suffering the same authority.
Okay. The next one's a little bit complex. I'll try to read it slowly. There's a little bit of a logical branch in it.
I don't know which one was harder, given the presentation or answering these questions.
Well, these gray hairs don't come for free. You have to earn it. It seems you're talking about Black experience in the history of the United States that doesn't apply identically to the history of Blacks native to Africa. Extrapolating from that assumption to consider Indigenous Americans, would it be valid or fair to say that the traumata of Indigenous peoples is of a different quality and quantity?
Yes, it's different, just as it is for the African, and just like it is for the Caribbean, Black person, and Black people across the diaspora. America's slavery is very specific. It's a very specific experience. It's different, but I think it's still relatable to any race that has been colonized. The specifics of what that means for them, or you or anyone else, is one part of it. But in respect to what I'm talking about, the inherited traumata is something that's still impacting them to this day. All of us on some scale, right? There's a really good paper on racial trauma by Lillian Como-Diaz, and she doesn't go into specifics about any particular race or population, but she kind of outlines like the fact that whether it's, slavery or, colonization of different countries or the slaughter of the indigenous population, the Mexican annexation, is that we bear the scars, we bear the pain of those experiences currently. Como Diaz, Lillian, I believe Como Diaz.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Henry Bloomfold had his hand up, and I don't see a question. So you want to give it a shot, Henry?
Yeah. Am I on?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, my chat doesn't work. So that's why I've been just sticking my hand up.
No, that's fine.
Okay.
I'd rather see you anyway.
Okay. Hi. Well, thank you so much for not only a lot of information, but a lot of inspiration, but a lot of like inside looking inside. But I have one simple question was if you could give us the reference for, I didn't hear the name of the author that talks about the ghosts and
All of them do.
yeah, I don't remember.
Every time, everybody's talking about ghosts around this work.
Yeah, I know. But you mentioned the guy's name, but I don't remember. If you could get us that.
Yeah.
Somewhere.
So Kirkland Vons has a.
That's the name.
Yeah, he has an excellent article.
That's VONTZ.
I'm putting it up. I'm going to put in the chat.
Oh, okay, good. Then I don't have to ask anymore. But I have a comment, and maybe you want to address it. So I was thinking I'll use some old analytic language, but I'm going to think about each practitioner has their own ability to merge and emerge from the merger of their trial identifications with their patient's trauma in the moment, or their ongoing trauma, or the intergenerational trauma. So I think that's the hardest part, because I've been going to many trauma conferences lately, because that's the newest thing to that people are trying to bring forward. And I don't get a sense from anybody like what which traumas they can tolerate. I was a supervisee of mine was working with a troubled man who tries to normalize S&M activity in his life.
Mm-hmm.
And as I was supervising him, it's like I suggested a couple of ways to reflect on it. He goes, I don't want to know that stuff. So, I mean, this was, I don't know what it is, transmission of trauma, but it's already, he knows, and it's an experienced fellow. He just, whatever his judgment, I don't want to know that guy's stuff, the pain or the defenses against it. So I was suggesting some approaches that are somatically based, or so I imagine it's that way with any kind of trauma, whether it's genocidal or Holocaust or Ukrainian right now, or back to slavery, or back to the genocides of Native Americans. So I don't know if you want to talk to it for yourself and what you noticed. If you supervise people, and if you notice any, what people can tolerate and what they need help for a window of tolerance, or just can't deal with it at all. I don't know if I said it well.
No, I mean, I can talk about it within the context of race and the fact that there's, again, it's infused with so much shame, and that I mean, and this is reflective of the profession too, that it's not talked about, which is the biggest racialized enactment of all, is that I don't want to know. I'm not going to talk about it. I might feel something in the room with my patient of color, or me with my white patient, but I'll keep it to myself. because of the shame and because, you know, if you come from a particular generation, it suggests that there's something wrong with you. If you have racist thoughts, if you have racist feelings, if you hurt basically, or if you're angry around it, if you have the rage towards the other because of their difference in their race, so rather than, you know, we have internalized racism because we live in a racist society. We breathe it, we live it every day. So it floors me. I guess it shouldn't, but sometimes it does frustrate me that with knowing that people are still very inclined to move away from it. Like, there must be something else to talk about other than race. We can focus on these other areas of the treatment other than race. When a person sitting across from you is a racialized being in this country. Now, what that means, it means a lot of different things, which maybe if there's some questions we can go into, but if there's anything that I've noticed over the years through supervision or through conferences or with other analysts in this field, is to get as far away from talking about race for a lot of, except in these venues, of course, as far away of, from talking about race as possible, or dismiss or pretty much erase its importance in some kind of way, subtly or directly. That's been my experience.
Can I say something, folks, or can I respond?
Sure.
Okay, I didn't know if I was taking, I was at another conference had more to do with the different traumas, but one with the Holocaust, and somebody came up with a construct that applies to any kind of trauma. And they talk about perpetrators, victims, bystanders, and upstanders. And that's a construct, not a psychodynamic construct, but a way of looking at the what happens in the traumatic situations. And we dealing with racism in this country, not just the Holocaust. That was a brief period compared to ongoing racism. I mean, how many of us, whether we're whatever color we are, whatever, I don't like to use race, but whatever identification group or tribe we identify with, as therapists, we might be bystanders. I mean, the way you're talking about dealing with racism in this country, and rather than upstanders, which might mean speaking up and being ousted from your tribe, the psychoanalytic tribe, if anybody is still that orthodox, where I go to meetings, they still are. I'll use it nicely, they're still orthodox, they're backwards, you know. But so we still have a lot of bystanders, which gives more power to the persecutor and victimizes the victims even more. So that's my contribution to your talk.
Thank you. I'm an upstander, right?
Yeah, you got it.
Along the lines of being an upstander, Christian asks if you could speak.
Can I? Fanny has her hand up. I don't know. Can we?
I didn't notice that.
Oh, that's okay. Hi, Fanny.
Hi. I wanted to, first of all, thank you for your talk tonight and for your information about that relationship that exists between you and your patients, that transferential relationship. And as an analyst, you know, I want to, I don't know, I feel like I just want to come in and just, you know, stand arm in arm with you as a Black woman also, right? And really talk about how difficult maybe for someone who is not a woman of color or a man of color to be a psychoanalyst and to not understand how culture comes into the relationship. And it's so layered, that relationship between that analytical dyad, right? And even with my own analyst and when I had my own analyst for over a decade, there were times she didn't understand about the kinship of culture. And yet I'm a Jungian analyst, right? And so Jung was very much into culture, right? And understanding culture, and psychoanalysis was made like that. It has cultural underpinnings, but it excluded Africanist underpinnings of culture, right? Like it wasn't acceptable in all different ways. And so now we are in the work of saying, wait a second, when someone is of my color or of a different ethnicities, even sitting across from me, it's in the room, it's in the work. And just because we haven't talked about it, it doesn't mean that it's not there. And so I don't think of it as splitting, I don't think of it as separating myself out. In fact, I believe it's a joining of all the aspects of myself, somatically, psychically, my unconscious self, my racial complex, all of these things, my childhood experiences, my ancestors, archetypally, all of those things are in there, right? In the field, in the phenomenological field, in the work. And so I think that's what I'm hearing you say. And
it is, you said it so beautifully. Thank you.
Oh yeah, thank you. No, thank
That's
you.
what I meant.
And I got it. And I feel I read something the other day that where someone who does intergenerational trauma work, I like to say intergenerational racial trauma work, where one of the key points is that when a person of color talks about their experience, that is their experience. And there may be a lack of desire to believe it or to want to hear it or, to question it, but it's like, it's our experience. And there was such a thing as an African Holocaust. And we are just now really beginning to even really reach into the dynamics of how painful and how much suffering there was there. So every time I think we can bring light to the darkness of that experience, I think it's powerful. So I want to thank you. I want to thank you for your work. Thank you.
Fanny.
Thank you.
Much appreciation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
The question that Christian had, wondering about the experience of that you're engaged in educating people about racial transference and countertransference. He says he can imagine that he imagines that you get a lot of pushback in the course of what you're trying to do.
You imagine, right, Chris? Yes. Sometimes it's subtle and sometimes it's pretty direct. I get some pushback. And I said it already, I get pushback around two things, which is like really analyzing racial transference up front, basically. Really emphasizing the importance of being attuned to it taking place in the field. And then I get pushbacks sometimes around centering Blackness. And that partly, I think that's for a number of reasons. One, because this is just, the ways that we are rigid around change in this field is that we still want to believe in this universal humanity. and universal experience. But that universal humanity and experience has always been couched in whiteness, in a Euro-Western philosophy. And so I get pushback about that. And then I also get pushback about centering Blackness because, and this is what perpetuates anti-Blackness, is that there's still like a denial, not wanting to believe like the globalness of anti-Blackness. How much vitriol and objection is directed and projected onto the Black body. So yeah, I do get pushback. But that's all right. I keep coming back.
I'm wondering if I could ask what's helpful in sort of facilitating these discussions. I do a lot of education around race and culture, cultural humility, where I work. And you know, the adding on the like pulling training about psychology and one psychology and race together, talking about racial transference and countertransference. It just seems like it's a vulnerable thing to kind of like talk about, even from my perspective, you know. And you know, I just could not. Maybe I'm just saying I feel your pain. Maybe that's what I'm saying. I feel your pain. You know, of the fight to get people to realize that this is real. Period.
I appreciate you saying that, and I think I thought about starting the presentation or saying this at some point, and definitely I definitely feel the support of PSP. So, and I want to acknowledge that because I talked to them about this a little bit before, to a certain degree, which is that these presentations are not easy for people of color to do. They're actually very in general. I know some people, maybe there's some people who do them with these. Let me just speak for myself. They're not easy for me to do. That they are actually very painful to process and to think about. And I even thought about this presentation and the things that I did leave out, because it just felt very hard to talk about in front of, you know, several people. And I think that needs to be taken in consideration when we come into these spaces. And sometimes it's not, it just isn't. So I appreciate you acknowledging that, Christian. It is real. And yes, I feel it. And yet I continue to do it because I'm so passionate about it. I think it's so important. I think it's so important to have more clinicians of color in this space and more clinicians of color doing this work. And so that is a tremendous amount of joy and fulfillment for me to be here and do that, and to see you all be here with me while I'm doing it.
Say one final thing, actually. I appreciate the Blackness injected into the orientation at the beginning of this, the interactive sort of nature about this, asking people to think about themselves and reflect on their bodies. I came into this presentation wearing a hoodie, and I was like, okay, I'm a Black man wearing a hoodie at a presentation like this, just got out of the gym. What does that mean to the people here? And you know, I hope people are. I'm very just thankful of you coming in.
Thank you, Christian.
Next question. Can you please expand when you discussed about protecting yourself in regards to Nate?
Yes, I was protecting my relationship to whiteness there. I was thinking, if he is, you know, I'm the analyst, I'm the mental health clinician, That's not all. I'll get to what I was really protecting. But I'm the analyst, I'm the mental health clinician, then I have to do the risk assessment and determine what do these guns mean. And so I went immediately to try to figure out, is he in danger of himself? Because I'm not going to lose my license. That was my protecting myself. But what I was really protecting myself from was not wanting to feel my own sense of helplessness, my own rage and anger about what I had been witnessing, what I had been experiencing, what I was experiencing in my body. So better to give it to him. He's the problem, not everything that's taking place in me.
Hi, yeah, that was me that asked that question. It really just resonated with me to a degree when you mentioned protecting yourself. And correct me if I'm wrong. I don't know if I heard this correctly because I was typing notes as you were speaking. You mentioned like white analytic authority. Did I say that right?
Yeah, you did.
Yeah, and so like, and this is more so probably like a question for me to figure out because for some time. Like, and I don't know who else resonates with this, but like my internalized racism is very much subconscious. And so like that made me ask myself, like, when I'm thinking of protecting myself when, in regards to a client's safety, like I'm starting to think like, am I doing that in terms of, just like that white analytic theory, or is there something deeper rooted in that with my own stuff coming up?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But I just wanted, thank you so much for expanding on that.
Sure, and thank you for sharing. Yeah.
Jen Kuntz asked, do you have any advice on how white analysts can facilitate Black patients speaking freely about racial trauma?
Mm-hmm. I'm going to call on my good friend, Julie. Julie, don't be mad. I'm calling on you. I'm going to respond and I'd be interested in hearing what you have to say. And I'm saying that because she does a lot of work around whiteness. Yes, I'm shouting you out too. I'd say that it definitely means doing your own work, be it weight work or work around your own racial trauma. Now, what does that mean? We don't think about white people and racial trauma, right? So much. But if you look at the history, and there's a great book on becoming white, there's a long history of Black and white people eventually who assimilate over generations, and now you're white, right? So I think it requires doing your own work in that area first, and work specifically around your anti-Blackness. And I don't know why our trainings, we only have a training, well, no, how do I say this? To be an analyst, you only have to, do a training analysis, essentially, when people should be in analysis for a lot longer than that. To do this work is very difficult. And it's good to know like what you've internalized. And you don't know that in 4 or 5 years, in my opinion. That's the thing. So yeah, I think it starts there, the work that you do around your own racialized identity first. And then all the things that I kind of spoke to, if you are bringing race into the room, if you are attuned to it, pay attention to what your patients of color talk about surrounding race, what they don't talk about. Patients talk about race a lot, believe it or not, in the extra transference. They're busy, they're gonna protect you. So you listen to what they're talking about in the extra transference, what they're talking about in respect to their friends, their lovers, their workplace, when they went into the grocery store and they weren't sure, but they thought maybe, that the clerk didn't want to touch their hand, things like that. It comes up. You just have to inquire and be interested and curious about it and pursue it.
Okay. The next question's kind of long. So if you have some popcorn. Janelle Noel, how can we further identify the difference between what may be trauma stored in our epigenetics versus trauma from repressed memories or memories not fully actualized, especially when a common theme among Black families in the United States is to minimize, romanticize, and erase the traumas and struggles we endured across generations, especially when there is so much about our history that we will never know because of the language barriers that came with illiteracy after Black people were freed in America. I'm not sure we had the language, especially in a chronically activated state, to even begin to identify with ourselves or those around us what was happening. What happens to all of that dysregulated emotional chaos? How might the unspoken parts of our history be manifesting in the lives of Black people every day?
Well, there's a few things there. I was following most of it because in a good way. I think that is what the trauma is, that which has been unspoken. And you're right about the archives, about the narratives, the historical narratives. Purposely, they're missing lots of information. It is partly because the narratives of slaves around literacy or talking about feeling the freedom to even talk about it, but purposely there are things missing from the archive. In respect to repressed memories, this is what you need to keep in mind. Trauma is whatever is dissociated. And whatever is dissociated is not a repressed memory. It's not symbolized. It can't be remembered because it cannot be symbolized through language or thought about fully. You can't make sense of it. So it becomes a bodily experience. Memories, right, have been symbolized. They've been encoded. So you can repress memories. And this has been my experience, is that working with traumatic reactions like dissociations and finding a way for them to feel their body, my patients are coming up with more of those repressed memories are coming to the surface. So I just want to distinguish that those are two different things. But I think it starts with working with that dissociated self states first, the stuff that they can't talk about because it just, their bodies are activated. It's just been fascinating to me. And I want to say that about repressed memories too. With some of my patients who many of them which started treatment with me a couple of years ago, knowing that they wanted to address issues around race. These are Black folks that were like, I want to address issues around race, but I don't really know exactly how it impacts my life. Like I've never really had to deal with racism directly. And then 2 sessions later, oh, I remember that. I remember that event in college when me and my friends got pulled over on the highway and checked for drugs. We were terrified. We rode home and never spoke of it again. Things like that happen all the time. I forgot about that. I haven't thought about that in 25 years. But it starts with working with the trauma reactions first. And sometimes it's not even a patient being really activated. Sometimes it's a patient being really detached and removed and not being able to connect with any feeling.
Okay. There's a question from Purvi Ben. Is it okay to share a link to Kashmir Files, a movie about genocide of Kashmiri Pandits in 1990? And there is in this To Everyone comment, a link to that. Just wanted to highlight that.
Okay, so I received a reply from you saying go ahead and do that. So I went ahead and shared that with them. Is it okay if I just say a little bit about it?
Sure.
Or I'm taking, okay, so basically, in Kashmir, which is called a paradise on earth, and it used to be really, really beautiful where people used to live together. And then in 70s, they started getting unrest after India and Pakistan's war. And Kashmir is very close to Pakistan. So they had terrorists who went over there and they actually kidnapped vice president's daughter. And India being India, they let go of 25 terrorists to release this one lady, young lady. And then terrorism took over. And killing started in 70s, little bit at a time. And on mosques, in the evenings, they would be announcing saying, "Leave it, die, or convert." And then they basically forced the Kashmiri Pandits to leave the valley. Then governor did not do much about it. He actually went and wine and dined with the terrorists. And so in the 90s, there was a mass killings, mass murders, and Kashmiri Pandits realized that nothing's going to happen. So they basically left the valley in a droves. When they came to the Srinagar, which is also part of India, they were put in the refugee tents. And the refugee tents did not have very good conditions. A lot of them died. Kashmir is a cold area. And when they came, where it's a hot weather, a lot of them died by the heat, a lot of them by the snake bites, and they was decimated. And then several years down, they decided to negotiate with the terrorists to say, okay, let's do some peace, which the Pandit said, this was really bad because here they are killed. And it's been 32 years and nobody talks about it. So one of the director, he went and he did only first person interviews. That means either you have seen these deaths or you have experienced someone in your family dying. He went all around everywhere the Kashmiri Pandits are and he made these movies. So go ahead.
I wanted to ask you, and I appreciate you sharing the movie. I might pronounce your name wrong.
It's fine.
I want to know what meaning this movie has for you personally.
I actually have a family who was in Kashmir, personally.
Mm-hmm.
When I say family in India, you consider if you have, it doesn't have to be like how African American as a kin families. Mm-hmm. Kinship is a kinship family. We had that. Mm-hmm. And they have to leave. I had a best friend, her grandfather was my teacher. And so some of the families were here, migrated in the 70s. Some of the family was still in 90s over there. And one of the daughter had, in India, when you get child, you go to parents' home and then go back. She went back and the whole family was massacred. So I actually know people. It's not my blood family, but they are someone I know very close to. So here's half of the families wiped off. And this is old grandfather. He's taking care of one daughter and two granddaughters. He's taking care of them, while rest of the family is killed brutally. And so my experience with that is, like I say, you could consider a second person experience. So, and I'm a Brahmin, so that's another thing. So that is also related. So, but I think because Indian government never talks about it, people don't talk about it, and then intellectuals, when they talk about it, they flip it over. And you always hear about how Kashmir is getting, Indian military is doing this and Indian military is doing that, but you never hear about this issue. And it's important that people know about them, because when the Pandits actually went all the way down to Supreme Court saying that we need to reopen the cases and we need to get justice, And the Supreme Court had said the time limit is expired, so we cannot do anything. So that's a movement of saying it's 30 years is too long time. A lot of people are dead. And there are people who were there as children. There are people who were there as a young people still alive. And so they are trying to do a movement where repetition the Supreme Court and say, please do something about it.
Okay.
Because it is generational trauma affecting pretty much everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity to share this. So some of the scenes, like when you see in a nutshell where they are, I'm giving away, but you will see 24 people getting killed. That was actually done again. That instance is from 2003. So it has not stopped yet. So whoever's.
So just for time, I'm sorry for
it's fine.
We have the link and people can watch it, and I certainly appreciate you sharing your
Thank you.
experience. Okay.
Another question, very glad that generational trauma is being addressed finally, and it doesn't seem that you can really separate it from the family trauma. And important to acknowledge outside events are important when doing psychotherapy. That's from Margaret Barris.
Yeah, you can't separate it. It's the family that's part of the transmission, right? It's all very connected.
I'm at the end of the questions, Chanda. There's a lot of thank yous for what you're doing, which I would add my own. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you very, very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Chanda, and thank you for your authenticity, your inside out way of bringing a teaching, inviting us into the room with you and Nate, and inviting us to sit with our feelings and our experience. There's a lot for us to sit with in the days and hours ahead on the basis of what you've said and shared with us. And also thank all of you for coming tonight and for your participation, your deep listening and engagement. And hopefully we will see you all again another time.
Great.
Thank you.
Be well, and
Gwen, please.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.